The night sky blanketed the sprawling farm with a suffocating darkness, the crescent moon casting weak silver light across the withering fields. The place was called Barrow's Hollow, a name whispered with unease in the nearby town. It had been abandoned for decades, though no one could quite agree on why. Some said it was the plague of 1934 that wiped out the Barrow family. Others swore it was something older, a curse tied to the land itself. Whatever the reason, no one dared tread near the place until tonight. A group of 4 thrill-seekers, driven by arrogance and dares, decided to explore Barrow's Hollow. There was Elias, their self-proclaimed leader, whose confidence often bordered on recklessness. Clara, his girlfriend, nervously clutched a flashlight, her eyes darting to every sound. Ben, the skeptic of the group, wore an uneasy smirk, masking his fear with sarcasm. Finally, there was Megan, quiet and cautious, trailing behind as if she could feel the farm breathing. The gate to the property hung on one rusted hinge, swaying in the faint breeze. The sound it made, a low, whining groan, seemed to linger in the air long after they pushed it open. As they stepped inside, the air changed. It wasn't colder, but it felt heavier, like an invisible weight pressed against their chests. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, a silhouette of sagging wood and shattered windows. The fields surrounding it were wild and untamed, rows of rotting cornstalks stretching out like skeletal arms. A scarecrow stood crooked in the middle of it all, its head a crude burlap sack with empty, stitched eye sockets. It seemed to be watching them. "Creepy enough for you?" Elias quipped, flashing a grin that no one returned. Clara shivered. "Let's just look around and go, okay?" They approached the farmhouse, the steps creaking under their weight. The door wasn't locked. It swung open with a hollow crack, revealing an interior choked with decay. The air reeked of mildew and something faintly metallic. The wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, exposing splintered wood beneath. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, frozen at 3:15, its pendulum missing. As the group fanned out, their footsteps echoed through the empty house. Megan found herself drawn to a doorway leading to the cellar. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a staircase descending into complete darkness. Her skin prickled as a faint sound drifted up, a wet, shuffling noise like something dragging itself across the floor. "Megan, what are you doing?" Ben's voice broke her trance, startling her. She shook her head and turned back to the group. "Nothing," she muttered, but the sound lingered in her mind. Elias led the way upstairs, insisting they check every room for clues to the farm's past. The bedrooms were a study in abandonment. Rusted bed frames, moldering mattresses, and scattered children's toys. In one room, Clara found an old photograph. It showed a family of 4 standing in front of the farmhouse, a man, a woman, and 2 young children. But the longer she stared at it, the more unsettled she felt. The eyes of the family seemed wrong, too wide, too dark, and brimming with an expression she couldn't place. She dropped the photo when she realized one of the children was smiling directly at her. "Clara, what's wrong?" Elias asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she clung to his arm, her breaths coming in short gasps. Downstairs, Megan couldn't shake the sound from the cellar. The others had ignored it, but she couldn't. Something compelled her back to that door. This time, she opened it wider, the wood groaning in protest. The smell hit her first, raw, earthy, and coppery. Then she saw them. Eyes, hundreds of them, reflecting her flashlight's beam embedded in the dirt walls of the cellar. She screamed, stumbling backward, but no one came. She ran upstairs to find the group, her heart pounding, but the house was different now. The walls seemed to close in, the hallways stretching endlessly. A shadow darted across her path, and she froze. It was small, childlike, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, bending unnaturally as it scurried away on all 4s. "Guys?" Megan's voice trembled as she called out. "Where are you?" The answer came in whispers, not from her friends, but from the walls themselves. They hissed and giggled, speaking her name in voices that overlapped and twisted. She covered her ears and ran blindly, finding herself back in the main room. The grandfather clock now ticked, its hands spinning wildly. Meanwhile, Elias, Clara, and Ben weren't faring better. They had become separated, each wandering through endless corridors that seemed to shift and change. Clara stumbled into a room filled with mirrors, but the reflections didn't match her movements. They stared at her, their faces slowly melting into expressions of pure malice. Ben found himself outside, or so he thought. The scarecrow was closer now, standing right at the edge of the porch. Its head twitched as if something inside it was alive. A guttural croak came from its stitched mouth. and then it began to move. Elias was in the attic, where the walls were covered in deep gouges, as though something had tried to claw its way out. He found a journal, its pages filled with frantic scrawls about the harvest and the watchers in the soil. The last entry was smeared with blood. "They are us now." The farmhouse consumed them, one by one. Clara's screams echoed as the mirrors swallowed her. Ben's flashlight fell to the ground, illuminating nothing but a spray of blood. Elias's journal dropped as unseen hands dragged him into the floorboards. Megan was the last. She stood in the main room, surrounded by the laughing whispers. The cellar door swung open on its own, and the eyes from below began crawling up the stairs, disembodied, glistening orbs with roots like veins trailing behind them. The last thing she saw before the lights went out was the scarecrow, now standing inside the room, its burlap head splitting open to reveal a mouth filled with rows of human teeth. By morning, the farmhouse was silent again, its secrets buried. The scarecrow stood in the field as always, but now there were 4 new additions tied to the posts, faces frozen in terror, their eyes black and hollow. The wind howled like a dying creature across the barren expanse of the farmland. The fields of Hollow Creek were long dead, their once thriving corn reduced to a forest of brittle, gray stalks that whispered when the breeze stirred them. No one had tended the land in decades, not since the red harvest of 1947, a story whispered in town but never spoken of in the open. The old farmers said the soil was cursed. The younger generation dismissed it as superstition. But the truth was more horrifying than anyone could imagine. David, a young drifter seeking odd jobs, stumbled across the farm during his aimless travels. His car had broken down miles away, and after hours of walking, he spotted the farmhouse. It loomed like a silhouette against the evening sky, its broken windows gaping like sockets of a skull. With no other choice, he made his way to the property, the dead fields crackling underfoot. The front porch sagged ominously under his weight as he knocked on the door. No one answered, but it wasn't locked. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the odor of something rotting. Dust coated every surface, but the faint sound of movement, scuttling like claws on wood, came from somewhere deep within. "Hello?" David called, his voice swallowed by the oppressive quiet. He half hoped no one would answer. The place felt wrong. But the hope of finding a phone, or at least shelter for the night, drove him deeper into the house. The furniture was sparse, as if the previous occupants had left in a hurry. A rusted lantern sat on a table near the entryway, its glass smeared with something dark. A photograph caught his eye, black and white, cracked with age. It showed a family of 5, a man, a woman, and 3 children. Their faces were blank, no expressions to speak of, and their eyes seemed to follow him as he moved. Shaking off the unease, David ventured toward the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed faintly, though the electricity in the house seemed otherwise dead. When he opened it, a stench hit him like a physical blow. Inside were jars, rows upon rows of glass jars, filled with something thick and red. He slammed the door shut, bile rising in his throat. A creak came from upstairs. "Hello?" David's voice wavered now. The sound was faint but distinct, slow, deliberate footsteps. Against his better judgment, he climbed the stairs, each groan of the wood beneath him louder than the last. At the top, a long hallway stretched before him, its wallpaper peeling like dead skin. Doors lined the corridor, most slightly ajar. He pushed the first one open, revealing a child's bedroom frozen in time. A tiny bed stood in the corner, its mattress covered in yellowed sheets. Toys were scattered across the floor, their forms twisted and melted as though burned. Something shifted behind him. He turned, but the hallway was empty. The faint scent of burning flesh tickled his nose. The next door revealed a room that shouldn't have existed. It was too large to fit the dimensions of the house. The walls were made of dark, rotted wood that pulsed faintly, as though alive. In the center stood a scarecrow. Its frame was made of knotted branches, its head a sack of burlap stitched with crude, black thread. But its arms were unmistakably human, their pale flesh nailed to the wood. David stumbled back, his foot catching on something soft. He looked down to see a doll, a child's doll, its porcelain face cracked, and its eyes, no, they weren't painted on. They blinked. The scarecrow moved, its head tilted with an audible snap, its eyeless gaze locking onto him. He bolted from the room, slamming the door behind him, but the hallway was no longer empty. The children from the photograph stood there now, their mouths stretched into grotesque smiles. Their eyes, hollow pits of darkness, wept trails of blood. David turned and ran back downstairs, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. But the house wouldn't let him go. The front door was gone, replaced by a wall of slick, blackened wood. The windows, too, had vanished, leaving him trapped in a nightmare. A voice whispered his name, soft and raspy. He turned toward the source, his knees buckling as he saw the man from the photograph standing in the kitchen doorway. His body was emaciated, his skin stretched taut over sharp bones, his mouth open too wide, his jaw unhinging as a swarm of flies poured out. David scrambled backward, tripping over the table. The lantern shattered on the floor, casting the room in flickering shadows. The man stepped closer, his movements jerky and unnatural, as if strings controlled him. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice a chorus of overlapping tones. "The soil. It takes what it is owed." David felt a hand grasp his ankle. He screamed, kicking wildly, but the grip was unrelenting. He looked down to see the floor itself had come alive. Roots, gnarled and thick, had erupted from the wood and coiled around his leg. They pulled him toward the cellar door, which now stood open, revealing a pit of writhing shadows below. He clawed at the floor, but the roots were too strong. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the scarecrow, standing at the top of the stairs, its human arms outstretched as if welcoming him home. The next morning, a car was found abandoned on the edge of Hollow Creek. The police searched the area, but there was no sign of the driver. The farmhouse remained as it always had, silent and decaying, the scarecrow watching over the dead fields. By nightfall, the photograph in the house had changed. It now showed 6 people, a man, a woman, 3 children, and a young drifter whose blank, expressionless face stared into eternity. The first thing Sarah noticed when she moved to the countryside was the sound. It was too quiet. Back in the city, noise was constant. Cars, voices, sirens. But here, the silence pressed against her like a living thing. Except for the crows. Their harsh cries echoed across the vast farmland behind her rented house. It unnerved her, how they perched on the same spot every day. An ancient, crooked tree at the far edge of the property, standing alone in a barren field. The landlord had warned her about the field, though he hadn't explained much. "It's fallow," he said, his leathery hands gripping the brim of his hat. "Nothing grows there, and it's best to leave it be." Sarah had nodded, dismissing his words as rural superstition. But now, standing at her kitchen window and staring out at the lifeless patch of earth, she felt the hairs on her neck rise. It wasn't just barren. It was wrong. The soil was dark, almost black, and the ground seemed to ripple slightly, as though something beneath it was breathing. She shook off the feeling. It was probably just uneven dirt or shadows playing tricks on her. Her first night in the house was restless. The quiet made her hyper-aware of every creak, every groan of the old wood. Around midnight, the crows began cawing. It wasn't their usual discordant calls. It was rhythmic, almost purposeful, as if they were warning her. Then came the scratching. It started faintly at the edges of the house, like twigs dragging across the siding. But the night was calm, with no wind to speak of. The sound grew louder, more frantic, moving up to her bedroom window. She froze in her bed, clutching the blankets as the scratching turned to tapping. She forced herself to look. A crow sat on the windowsill, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. Its black eyes glinted in the moonlight, and it didn't move even when she screamed. By morning, the crow was gone, leaving only faint claw marks on the glass. She convinced herself it had been a bad dream. But the unease stayed with her. The next day, Sarah decided to explore the farmland. She needed something to do, and maybe some fresh air would clear her mind. She avoided the fallow field, though. The crows were still there, gathered in the gnarled tree, watching her with unsettling intensity. She followed a narrow dirt path that wound through the property and eventually came across an old barn. The structure leaned precariously, its roof sagging and its doors hanging open. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of decay. A pile of rusted tools sat in one corner, and a ladder led up to a hayloft. A strange symbol was scrawled on the far wall, drawn in what looked like dried blood. It was circular, with jagged lines radiating outward. She stared at it, her stomach twisting. A sudden crash from the loft made her jump. Something heavy had fallen. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. She climbed the ladder slowly, each rung creaking under her weight. At the top, the loft was empty except for a tattered bale of hay. But the hay wasn't what drew her attention. It was the freshly disturbed soil beneath it. Something had been buried there, and recently. The sound of footsteps on the barn floor made her spin around, but when she looked down, no one was there. The barn door slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged as she scrambled down the ladder, nearly falling in her haste. When she reached the door, it opened easily. Outside, the sky had darkened unnaturally. The tree in the fallow field seemed closer, though she knew that was impossible. The crows had left it, their absence more unsettling than their presence. She ran back to the house, locking the doors behind her. That night, the scratching came again, louder than before. This time, it came from the walls inside the house. Terrified, she armed herself with a kitchen knife and searched every room. When she reached the basement, the scratching stopped. The silence was worse. The door to the basement creaked open on its own. She stood at the top of the stairs, staring into the pitch-black void below. Something moved. Just a shadow, she told herself, but her legs refused to descend. A voice rose from the darkness, faint and childlike. "Help me." Her blood ran cold. It sounded wrong, like a voice imitating a child rather than an actual one. Still, some primal part of her couldn't resist. She stepped down the stairs, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The basement was empty, except for a wooden trapdoor in the center of the floor. The voice came again. "Please. I'm so cold." The trapdoor rattled as if something beneath it was trying to break free. She backed away, heart pounding, but her retreat was halted by a sudden pressure on her shoulder. She turned to find nothing behind her, nothing but the faint outline of handprints in the dust on her shirt. The trapdoor burst open and a mass of writhing black tendrils shot out, filling the room with an unholy shriek. She fled up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut and piling furniture against it. But the sound followed her, scratching, tapping, whispering. The next morning, she packed her car, ready to leave. But when she stepped outside, the fields had changed. The fallow patch was no longer barren. It teemed with thick, pulsating vines that coiled like serpents. The crooked tree stood at the center, impossibly tall now, its branches reaching like skeletal arms, and at the base of the tree, half buried in the dark soil, were dozens of human skulls, their empty sockets staring up at her. She ran to her car, but the engine wouldn't start. The crows were back, circling overhead, their cries deafening. The last thing she saw before the darkness closed in was a figure standing in the field, its body wrapped in vines, its face hidden beneath a burlap sack. It raised an arm, pointing directly at her. By the time the authorities arrived days later, the house was empty. The farmland was untouched, as though no one had lived there for years. But in the fallow field, the tree still stood, and the crows still watched, and if you got too close, you could hear the scratching, faint but constant, just beneath the soil. The forest that bordered Blackthorn Farm had always been off-limits. Locals told stories of strange disappearances, whispers in the trees, and the eerie lights that flickered deep within at night. Some claimed the forest was haunted. Others spoke of creatures older than man. But Jacob didn't believe in stories. He had inherited the farm from his estranged uncle, a man he barely remembered and whom the townsfolk only referred to as a recluse. The property had fallen into disrepair, broken fences, an overgrown yard, and livestock pens long abandoned. But the forest was the worst. The tree line loomed like a jagged wall, the gnarled branches twisting into unnatural shapes, reaching out as if trying to drag the farm into its depths. The first night, Jacob lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the countryside was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Then came the knocking. It wasn't at the door, but somewhere outside, 3 sharp, deliberate raps that echoed through the still night. Jacob sat up, his chest tightening. Grabbing a flashlight, he ventured onto the porch. "Hello?" he called into the dark, his voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. The beam of his flashlight swept across the overgrown yard, illuminating nothing but the swaying grass. The knocking came again, louder this time, from the direction of the barn. Reluctantly, he crossed the yard. The barn door stood ajar, creaking faintly as it swayed in the breeze. Inside, the smell of damp hay and decay filled his nostrils. Dust motes danced in the air, illuminated by his flashlight. "Is someone in here?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. No response, but the sound of soft, wet breathing came from the far corner. He hesitated, his flashlight trembling in his hand before stepping closer. The beam landed on an animal carcass, what might have once been a goat. Its ribs jutted out, the flesh around them shredded and raw as though it had been chewed on. Something had dragged it here. But what? Jacob spun at the sound of footsteps behind him. His flashlight caught a fleeting glimpse of a shadow disappearing into the woods, too tall and thin to be human. His heart pounded as he stumbled back to the house, locking the doors behind him. The next day, he found claw marks on the barn door, long, deep gouges that looked fresh. He told himself it was just a wild animal. Coyotes, maybe. But deep down, he knew the tracks leading from the barn to the forest weren't made by any animal he'd ever seen. By the second night, the knocking turned to scratching. It came from all sides of the house, as if something circled the building, dragging claws across the walls. Jacob stayed in the living room, clutching a shotgun, the faint glow of a lamp doing little to ease his terror. At midnight, the scratching stopped. The silence was worse. Then from the back door, a whisper. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakably a voice. "Jacob, let us in." His stomach dropped. He hadn't told anyone he was moving here. No one should have known his name. He didn't move, barely dared to breathe as the voice came again. "We're so cold, Jacob. Won't you help us?" Something slammed against the door, rattling it in its frame. He raised the shotgun, his hands slick with sweat. The doorknob twisted, though the lock held, and then laughter. High-pitched, childlike, but wrong, two-layered as though a dozen voices laughed at once. When the sun rose, Jacob finally opened the door, expecting damage or claw marks. Instead, there was nothing. The only sign of disturbance was a line of small, bare footprints in the dirt, leading back into the forest. Jacob decided to cut the forest down. He hired a crew, not telling them why, only that the trees had to go. The workers arrived, joking about haunted woods as they set up their equipment. But as soon as the chainsaws roared to life, the air changed. The breeze stopped. The sun dimmed, though no clouds covered it. And then the trees began to move. Not sway in the wind, move. Their roots tore free from the ground, twisting and writhing like snakes. The branches lashed out, knocking the chainsaws aside as the workers screamed. One man was dragged into the shadows, his cries cut off abruptly. Jacob ran, the sounds of snapping wood and shouts fading behind him. He didn't stop until he was back in the house, bolting the doors and closing every curtain. That night, the knocking returned. Louder, more insistent. This time the voice wasn't at the door. It was inside. "Jacob?" He turned to see a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was impossibly tall, its head brushing the ceiling, with limbs too long and thin to be human. Its face was hidden beneath a mask of bark, and its fingers ended in sharp, black claws. "You shouldn't have disturbed us," it rasped. Before he could raise the shotgun, the windows shattered. Branches, no, arms made of twisted wood reached in, wrapping around him. The figure stepped closer, its head tilting unnaturally. The forest takes what it's owed. Jacob's screams were cut short as he was dragged out into the night. By morning, the workers had vanished, their vehicles abandoned. The farm was quiet, the forest untouched. In the center of the woods, a new tree had appeared. Tall, gnarled, and twisted, its bark marked with faint claw marks. If you listened closely, you could hear faint whispers in the breeze, calling for anyone foolish enough to come closer. The old lighthouse at Widow's Point had stood abandoned for nearly a century. Locals said it was cursed, haunted by the spirits of sailors lost to the jagged rocks below. Few dared venture near it. The narrow cliffside path leading to the lighthouse was treacherous, and at night a strange, ghostly glow emanated from the cracked windows. Lila had heard the stories all her life, but she was a skeptic. As an amateur photographer, she relished the thought of capturing the decayed beauty of the structure. It would make a great addition to her portfolio. Ignoring the warnings, she set out at dusk with her camera slung over her shoulder. The path was worse than she'd expected. Loose stones skittered down the cliffs with every step, and the roar of the waves crashing below seemed unnaturally loud. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged against the blood-red sky. When she reached the entrance, the door was ajar. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of salt and decay. Inside, the walls were streaked with black mold, and the spiral staircase winding up to the lantern room was rusted and precarious. The first floor was empty. save for an overturned table and a few shattered glass jars. Strange symbols had been scratched into the walls, circles and jagged lines that reminded her of constellations. She snapped a few photos, her flash casting brief, stark shadows. As she climbed the staircase, the air grew colder. The steps groaned under her weight, and she gripped the rusted railing tightly. Halfway up, she thought she heard a faint whisper. She stopped, holding her breath, but the only sound was the distant crash of the waves. The lantern room was worse than the rest of the lighthouse. The windows were smeared with grime, distorting the light of the setting sun. A massive, rusted lantern sat in the center, its glass cracked. More symbols covered the walls, but these were more intricate, almost deliberate. As Lila raised her camera, the whispers returned, louder now. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, overlapping voices murmuring in a language she didn't understand. The hairs on her arms stood on end. She spun around, the camera falling from her hands and clattering to the floor. She wasn't alone. In the corner of the room stood a figure, a man, dressed in a torn, salt-stained coat. His face was gaunt, his skin gray as ash. His eyes, sunken deep into his skull, glowed faintly with an unnatural light. "Help us," he rasped, his voice like the wind through broken glass. Before Lila could scream, the room seemed to shift. The walls stretched and twisted, the windows darkening until the faint light of the sunset disappeared. The air grew thick, pressing down on her chest like a weight. The man stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural. Behind him, more figures emerged. Sailors, their bodies twisted and broken, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. They reached for her, their fingers impossibly long and blackened as if burned. Lila stumbled back, her foot catching on the edge of the lantern. She fell hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. The figures loomed closer, their whispers turning into screams. Howls of pain and anger that reverberated through the room. "Leave," one of them shrieked, its voice so loud it felt like it would split her skull. "Before you join us." Lila scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking. She bolted down the staircase, the rusted metal cutting into her palms as she gripped the railing. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more desperate. At the base of the lighthouse, she paused just long enough to glance back. The figures were gone, but the lantern room glowed with an otherworldly light. A shadow moved across one of the windows, tall, angular, and wrong. She didn't stop running until she was back at her car, gasping for air and shaking so violently she could barely fit the key into the ignition. When she looked back at the lighthouse one last time, the glow had faded. The structure stood silent and dark against the night sky. That night, Lila dreamed of the lighthouse. She stood at the edge of the cliffs, staring into the water below. Faces stared back at her, dozens of them, their mouths open in silent screams. When she woke, her camera was sitting on her bedside table. She hadn't brought it home. Heart pounding, she turned it on. The photos from the lighthouse were there, but they weren't what she had taken. Each shot showed the same thing, the lantern room, its windows glowing, and a figure standing in the center, a tall, angular shadow with glowing eyes. The final photo was of her. She was standing in the lantern room, staring at the camera, her face pale and lifeless, her eyes glowing faintly. The whispers returned that night, louder and closer. By morning, Lila's bed was empty, her belongings untouched. Her car was found at the edge of the cliffs, the keys still in the ignition. And at the lighthouse in the lantern room, a new figure appeared among the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly as it watched the sea. The small village of Ashwick was known for its ancient well, a crumbling stone structure that had stood in the town square for centuries. No one knew how deep it was, only that its water had long since run dry. Stories about the well varied. Some claimed it was cursed, others whispered that it was a gateway to hell. Parents warned their children to stay away, and even the most skeptical villagers gave it a wide berth. But Kayla wasn't a villager. She was an urban archaeologist, fascinated by old structures and their hidden histories. When she heard about the well, she couldn't resist investigating. The villagers were tight-lipped when she asked about it, their eyes dark with fear. "Leave it alone," an elderly woman said, gripping Kayla's arm with surprising strength. "That well has taken enough." Kayla brushed off the warnings, chalking them up to superstition. On a cold, misty morning, she arrived at the square with her camera, flashlight, and a rope. The air felt heavier near the well, the faint scent of damp earth rising from its depths. She peered over the edge and shivered. The darkness seemed to swallow the light. Using the rope, Kayla lowered herself into the well. The stone walls were slick with moss, and the air grew colder the farther she descended. The village square above her grew smaller and smaller until it was nothing more than a pinprick of light. At about 30 feet down, her feet touched solid ground. The bottom of the well was wider than she'd expected, almost like a small cavern. The walls were covered in strange carvings, intricate patterns of eyes, spirals, and clawed hands. She traced them with her fingers, marveling at the detail. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly, though the ground was dry. She turned on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. At the far end of the cavern, a tunnel stretched into the earth. Curiosity got the better of her. Kayla squeezed into the tunnel, crawling on her hands and knees. The air grew colder, the walls narrowing until she could barely move. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into another chamber. This one was larger, and in the center stood a stone altar. A faint, sickly green light pulsed from cracks in the floor, illuminating the room in a dim, eerie glow. The altar was covered in bones, small ones like those of animals, but among them were fragments that looked disturbingly human. Kayla's stomach churned. She stepped closer, unable to look away. On the altar lay a single object, a rusted iron mask with jagged edges. It seemed to vibrate faintly, as if alive. As she reached out, the air around her shifted. The green light flickered, and a low, guttural whisper filled the chamber. "Who disturbs my rest?" Kayla froze. The voice was deep and layered, as though 100 voices spoke at once. She spun around, her flashlight beam shaking. The walls of the chamber began to move. No, not move, but ripple, as if something massive was pressing against them from the other side. She backed away, her foot striking something hard. It was a skull, its hollow eyes staring at her accusingly. The whispering grew louder, words she couldn't understand, but that filled her head with a sickening dread. The mask on the altar began to glow, its rusted surface slick with what looked like fresh blood. Kayla turned to run, but the tunnel behind her had disappeared. The chamber had shifted, the walls closing in, leaving her trapped. A shadow began to rise from the altar, tall, skeletal, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its face was featureless, save for a gaping mouth that stretched too wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth. "Stay," it hissed, the word vibrating through her bones. "You've come to join us." Kayla screamed, the sound swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The last thing she saw was the shadow lunging toward her, its claws outstretched. When the villagers checked the well the next morning, they found Kayla's rope neatly coiled by the edge, but there was no sign of her. That night, the whispers began. Faint at first, they grew louder with each passing day. The villagers reported hearing their names called in the dead of night, voices coming from the well. Weeks later, a young boy claimed to see a woman's face in the darkness of the well, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth silently screaming. No one went near the well after that. And on nights when the mist rolled in, villagers swore they could see faint green light flickering from its depths, as if something or someone was still waiting below. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, there was a stretch of road known as Widow's Hollow. It was a narrow, twisting path that carved through dense forests and jagged cliffs. Drivers avoided it whenever possible, claiming it was cursed. The legends all shared one chilling detail. If you heard a woman crying on the road, you must not stop. If you did, you would never make it out of the hollow. Eric didn't believe in curses. He was a truck driver, practical to the core, and Widow's Hollow was a shortcut that would shave hours off his trip. As he drove the winding road late one stormy night, the trees pressed close on either side, their branches clawing at the sky. Rain hammered against his windshield, the wipers barely able to keep up. The first sound was faint, so soft that he thought it might have been the wind. But as he rounded another bend, it grew louder, the unmistakable sound of a woman sobbing. Eric tightened his grip on the wheel. The rational part of his brain told him to ignore it. This was the middle of nowhere, and no one in their right mind would be out here on foot in this weather. But what if someone needed help? The sobbing grew louder, closer. Against his better judgment, Eric slowed the truck, his headlights piercing the darkness. A figure appeared on the side of the road, A woman, drenched from head to toe, her long hair plastered to her face. She wore a tattered white dress that clung to her body, the fabric streaked with mud. Eric rolled down the passenger window just enough to call out, "Hey, are you all right?" The woman turned toward him, and his stomach twisted. Her face was wrong, too pale, her eyes sunken and dark, her lips trembling as she whispered something he couldn't hear. "What?" he asked, leaning closer. "Help me," she said, her voice breaking. Against every instinct, Eric pulled the truck to a stop and opened the door. "Hop in," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman climbed into the passenger seat without a word. Water pooled on the floor beneath her, and the air grew colder, so cold that Eric could see his breath. "Where are you headed?" he asked, but she didn't answer. She stared straight ahead, her hands clutching the fabric of her dress so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Eric drove in silence, the unease growing with every mile. He tried the radio, but all he got was static. The GPS flickered, the screen going black. And then the sobbing started again. It wasn't coming from the woman. She sat motionless, her lips pressed into a thin line. The sound was coming from the back of the cab. Eric glanced in the rearview mirror, and his blood ran cold. The reflection showed not just the woman beside him, but another figure in the back seat. A shadowy presence with glowing eyes and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide, weeping black tears. His heart pounded as he swerved the truck, the tires skidding on the wet road. "What the hell?" he began, but his voice was drowned out by a deafening scream. It came from everywhere at once, shaking the truck and making his ears ring. The woman beside him finally turned to face him. Her eyes were black voids, her mouth splitting open in a ghastly smile that revealed jagged, broken teeth. "You shouldn't have stopped," she hissed, her voice a guttural growl. The truck lurched to a stop, the engine cutting out. The lights flickered and died, leaving Eric in total darkness. He fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking, but when he turned it on, he was alone. The woman, the shadow, and the road itself were gone. He was sitting in the cab of his truck, surrounded by dense forest, with no sign of Widow's Hollow. The truck wouldn't start, and his phone had no signal. Eric was found the next morning, wandering along a highway miles from where he should have been. He was incoherent, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling. When he finally spoke, all he could say was, "Don't stop! Don't stop!" for her. Locals found his truck later that day, still parked on the edge of Widow's Hollow. The seats were soaked with water and the passenger door was wide open. No one drove that road again after dark. Those who did swore they could still hear the faint sound of a woman crying, echoing through the trees. And if they looked in their rearview mirror for too long, they'd see a figure sitting in the back seat, watching them with glowing eyes. Deep in the woods of northern Maine, there was an old boarding school called Blackridge Manor. Abandoned for decades, it was said to be cursed. The locals told stories of strange lights in its windows at night, of people who went inside and never came back out. The building loomed like a corpse among the trees, its facade cracked and overgrown with vines. Leah and her friends didn't believe in curses. They were amateur ghost hunters, eager for a thrill. On a crisp October night, armed with flashlights, cameras, and a spirit box, they set out to explore the manor. The front doors creaked ominously as they pushed them open. Inside, the air was cold and stale, the faint scent of rot lingering. The main hall was vast, its once grand staircase now splintered and sagging. Faded portraits of stern-faced men and women lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow the group as they moved. "This is perfect," Leah said, setting up her camera. "We're definitely getting activity here." "Let's split up," suggested Mark, the most adventurous of the group. "Cover more ground." The others hesitated, but eventually agreed. Leah stayed in the main hall, Mark went upstairs, and the remaining two, Sarah and Ethan, ventured toward the east wing. Leah started with the spirit box, the device crackling with static as she asked questions. "Is anyone here with me? Can you give me a sign?" The static grew louder, then faded, replaced by a faint voice. "Leave." She froze. It had sounded like a child, soft and pleading. "Why should I leave?" she asked. The reply came faster this time, the voice distorted. "They'll come." "Who?" Leah pressed, but the box went silent. At that moment, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. She grabbed her flashlight and ran toward the sound. Mark was on the second floor exploring what had once been the dormitories. The doors to the rooms hung open, like revealing rows of decaying beds and broken furniture. He was halfway down the hall when he heard it, a low, wet sound like something being dragged across the floor. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. From one of the rooms, something moved. A figure, pale and emaciated, with hollow eyes and matted hair, crawled into the hallway. Its movements were jerky, almost insect-like, as it pulled itself forward on bony hands. Mark screamed and bolted, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the exit always just out of reach. Behind him, the sound of dragging grew louder. Meanwhile, Sarah and Ethan had discovered an old classroom. The desks were covered in thick layers of dust, and the blackboard was scrawled with faded writing. Ethan shined his flashlight on it, squinting to make out the words. "They never leave," he read aloud. As he spoke, a cold breeze swept through the room, slamming the door shut. "Did you feel that?" Sarah whispered. Ethan nodded, but before he could respond, the desks began to move. They scraped across the floor, forming a circle around the pair. The air grew heavy, and a low, guttural hum filled the room. In the corner, a shadow darker than the rest of the room began to grow, twisting and writhing. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. She grabbed Ethan's arm and yanked him toward the door. But no matter how hard they pulled, it wouldn't budge. Leah found Mark on the staircase, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" she asked. It touched me," he stammered, holding out his arm. Long, jagged scratches ran down his forearm, as though something had grabbed him with claws. "We have to go. Now." They hurried to find Sarah and Ethan, shouting their names. The house seemed to shift around them, the walls narrowing and the shadows growing longer. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a step behind them, every flicker of their flashlights revealing movement that vanished the moment they turned to look. When they reached the east wing, they found the classroom door ajar. Inside, the desks were overturned, and Sarah and Ethan were nowhere to be seen. A child's voice echoed through the room. "They belong to us now." The shadow in the corner began to move, taking shape. It grew taller, its form vaguely humanoid, but with limbs that bent the wrong way. Its eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpricks of white in the darkness. "Run," Leah whispered, grabbing Mark's hand. They sprinted toward the front door, the shadow pursuing them. It moved impossibly fast, its twisted limbs scraping against the walls and ceiling. Just as they reached the exit, Leah tripped. She turned, her flashlight illuminating the creature as it loomed over her, its mouth stretching open to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Leah woke in the forest, the manor nowhere in sight. Mark was beside her, unconscious but breathing. Their gear was gone, and neither of them could remember how they'd escaped. When they returned to town, they discovered that Sarah and Ethan were never found. The locals shook their heads knowingly, muttering about Black Ridge's toll. Leah never went back, but sometimes in her dreams she heard the voice of the child, soft and pleading. "Come back, you forgot something," and always behind it the sound of something dragging. There's a story told in the quiet backwaters of Louisiana, whispered among the bayous and passed down through generations. The tale of the singing swamp. Locals say that on certain nights, when the moon is full and the mist clings low to the water, you can hear a haunting melody drifting through the cypress trees. They warn anyone who hears it not to follow the sound, for it leads to a place no one ever returns from. Julia and her boyfriend, Sam, didn't believe in ghost stories. They were city folk on a weekend getaway, renting a small cabin near the swamp to escape the noise and chaos of urban life. The air was thick with the scent of moss and stagnant water, and the only sounds were the occasional croak of a bullfrog or the rustle of unseen creatures. On their second night, as they sat on the porch drinking wine, Julia heard it. A soft, mournful tune, like a lullaby carried on the wind. She set down her glass, tilting her head to listen. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Sam nodded, a curious look on his face. "Sounds like someone singing." "It's beautiful," Julia said. The melody was hypnotic, each note pulling at filling her with an unexplainable longing. Sam shrugged. Probably just some locals out on the water. But the sound grew louder, more insistent. Julia felt an almost magnetic pull toward it. She stood, her eyes fixed on the dark line of trees at the edge of the property. "Let's go see where it's coming from." Sam hesitated. "It's late, and these swamps are dangerous, Julia. Let's just enjoy the music from here." But she was already walking, her feet crunching on the gravel path that led toward the water. Sam cursed under his breath and followed, a flashlight in one hand and his phone in the other. The swamp was alive with shadows, the gnarled roots of the cypress trees stretching like skeletal fingers into the murky water. The singing grew louder, clearer, but no matter how far they walked, they couldn't seem to find its source. "Julia," Sam said, his voice low, "I don't like this. Let's go back." "Just a little further," she murmured, her eyes wide and unfocused. Her steps quickened, and Sam struggled to keep up. The flashlight's beam danced over the water, reflecting off the mist. In the distance, a faint glow appeared, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. The song seemed to come from that light, its melody wrapping around them like an invisible thread. "Julia, stop!" Sam grabbed her arm, but her skin was cold, and she pulled away with surprising strength. "It's not safe! I have to see it," she said, her voice distant. She stepped off the path and into the swamp, the water rising to her knees. Sam shouted her name, but she didn't turn back. The glow grew brighter, the song louder. Desperate, he plunged into the water after her, the mud sucking at his boots. The swamp seemed to come alive around him, whispers in the trees, ripples in the water, unseen things brushing against his legs. Julia reached a small island surrounded by a tangle of roots. In its center stood a figure, a woman, pale as moonlight, her hair flowing like black water around her face. Her eyes were empty sockets, and her mouth was open wide, the haunting melody spilling from it. "Julia, get away from her!" Sam screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the song. The woman turned her hollow gaze toward him, her mouth stretching impossibly wide. The song grew louder, deafening, and Sam fell to his knees, clutching his ears. When he looked up, Julia was gone. The woman was gone. The light and the song had vanished, leaving only silence and darkness. The next morning, Sam was found by a local fisherman, sitting in the swamp, dazed and covered in mud. He couldn't explain what had happened, only that Julia was gone. The locals shook their heads when they heard his story. "The singing swamp," they said. "She heard the song, didn't she?" Sam tried to go back, tried to find the island, but the swamp refused to let him. Paths twisted, landmarks disappeared, and the more he searched, the more lost he became. To this day, he still hears the melody sometimes, faint and distant, like a memory he can't escape. And on misty nights, those who live near the swamp say they see a woman walking among the trees, her face pale and her eyes empty, humming a mournful tune that no one dares follow.